it seems to me, I'm calling it a slow motion collapse. I don't know how slow the motion is anymore. Talk about what's that, man. I'm looking, troops are encircled. They're negotiating their surrender. These battle lines are collapsing and they don't have any place to fall back to. We always try to do timelines and they've never worked, but it doesn't look like they got it. I'll put it like this. It's clear the Biden administration wants to hold out to the elections. Things don't look real good for them right now. Because, and I'll add this and then throw this to you. Once things start to crumble on the battle lines, once you start to hear they want to ship people back to fight and they don't want to come, the people are angry. We've got the people are starting to get angry and restive underneath. And Zelensky's political future is in question as of May 21st. He officially should be gone, but he ain't going to be gone. Let's talk about what's happening on the battle lines. We'll start there and see how that affects the rest of this house of cards. Scott Ritter.
Well, it's interesting. Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russia, was talking, I believe, yesterday. And for the first time, normally he speaks of, it's an active defense, but he uses the term defense. Never once have you heard Shoigu talk about Russia's on the offense. Yesterday he said, and now that our offense is developing. You're like, well, wait a minute. What? The Minister of Defense just said that Russia's on the offense. And the Russians, if you know anything about them, words mean everything to them. They are not fat, footloose and fancy free with their words. I was taught that by a Russian diplomat back when I was a weapons inspector in Iraq, because I'm your typical American. I just come in and I open my mouth and stuff comes out. And I'll just sit there and sometimes I thought I knew I was going to say it, halfway through I'm like, well, I'm going to shift gears. And I'm just throwing words out there. And in the end, I get my point across and it sounds good. And he pulled me aside and he said, you can't say that, Scott. I said, well, yeah, but I mean, everybody knows what I mean. No, Scott, words have meaning. When you say something, that word means something. And now that word and that meaning is attached to you and you've said it. And you can't walk away from that because now you have to admit that you were wrong and then people won't trust you anymore. You have to be very careful with your words. One of the more important lessons in my life, I wish I had followed it, as assiduously as I should have. I try to adhere to that, but, I'm not Russian trained. He is a Russian school trained diplomat. And Shoigu is a Russian school trained minister. So words mean everything. And so he has just said that Russia is on the offensive. And what that means is that he is reflecting a strategic shift in Russia. And this should scare the living out of all Ukrainians and everybody in NATO and everywhere else, because Russia's no longer, when Russia was on the defensive or an active defense, Russia was considering a certain list of potential outcomes for this conflict, one of which was, as we know, the Istanbul communique. Basically, even though it's negotiated by Russia, it sounds like a surrender document for Russia because it gives Ukraine just about everything they wanted except Donbass and Crimea. Now they're not going to get Zaporizhzhia and Kherson, but Russia always had a modification of that on the table, much to the consternation of many Russians who were like, hell no, we're not going to accept that. But the Russian government is saying, we're in the active defense. We're putting the feelers out there. We always left the door open for negotiations. We have a modified variant of the Istanbul communique on the table. Russia's on the offensive now. That modified communique is off the table. Done. Russia has a whole new, and Russia isn't the kind of nation that, slow to harness, quick to ride. Once you harness the Russian, team, they're gone and they ain't coming back. The Russians aren't fickle. They don't go, well, we're going to do, oh no, we're going to do this. They got the whole system lined up. They got everything going. They got their defense industry. They got every aspect of their national security architecture has been aligned for the offensive to achieve objectives. And this is where we're at right now. So this is a strategic shift, a big shift on the part of the Russians. And its timing, we see what we're looking at on the battlefield, Garland, is sort of the evidence of this transition. To the untrained eye, it looks like it's just a bigger version of the active defense that they were running before, where they're improving their lines here, improving their lines there. The Russians are beyond improving their lines. Russia is in the business of advancing now, and they are advancing to achieve deeper objectives, which means that they are in the business of reclaiming all of the Donbass, all of Zaporizhia, all of Kherson. These are legally part of Russia from their mindset. They're in the business of surrounding Kharkov. Whether or not they go into Kharkov is another question, but surrounding Kharkov, creating this buffer zone that keeps that keeps Ukrainian troops from invading Belgorod. They're going to eliminate that border region there so that Ukrainian troops can't go into Russia anymore. They can't shell Russia anymore. Russia's in the business of creating the buffer zone they've been threatening all along. And this means all of Kharkov, probably all of Sumy, is going to be taken by the Russians. And at some point in time, Mykolaiv and Odessa are going to fall. That's my assessment. I think those will be the last to go. But that's what we're looking at. General Lapin, I think it's Alexander Lapin, airborne general, he was a hero of Russia, won it in 2022 for leading counterattacks. So a very brave man. He got caught up in Russian politics, and he got caught up in controversy, and he got relieved of command. And but unlike in the United States, where if you get relieved command, that means retirement, the Russians don't retire good generals. The guy's a hero of Russia. He got the gold star for a reason. He's got, cojones. They just sent him off and retrained him. They said, okay, we're going to unplug you here, get you out of the headlines. We're going to send you back to the Combined Arms Academy, or send you to the General Staff Academy. Then we're going to pull you out. And you remember in World War II where Patton was put in charge of a fake army there in the back and all that, but they were really preparing the Third Army for him. And in the last minute, Patton comes in the head of the Third Army. They go in and Operation Cobra, and the rest is history. Lapin's showing up with 100,000 men. And these are men that aren't trained for an active defense. These are men that are trained for offensive operations. And he's showing up right now with 100,000 men. Where he goes, I don't know. Maybe Kharkov, maybe to complete the reconquest of Donetsk, but he's there, and they're going to keep going. The Russian Air Force is expanding the scope and scale of its actions. The Russians are targeting Ukrainian defense industry. We're seeing the collapse that we talked about. It's been taking a long time. Apparently that thread that we've been waiting to fray and then unravel, and the whole thing falls apart. The Ukrainians have been in there, reinforcing it with Kevlar. You got to give the Ukrainians credit where credit is due, because their military has stood fast under conditions that no other military would tolerate. The Ukrainians have shown a willingness to accept casualties and retain a certain level of combat cohesion. Again, how many times can you rotate a unit out? You send in a brigade, it suffers 60% casualties. You bring it out, you re-equip it, retrain, and you send it back in. And there right now, some of these brigades have been rotated out 3 or 4 times in recent history, meaning that they're losing everybody, but they still go back in, but they're not now. You have brigades right now that are just saying, we're not going back in there. We're not doing that. You have other brigades that are on the front line saying, get us out of here. We're not going to die anymore. We're done with this dying game. And as that happens, you have a certain fluidity on the battlefield right now that creates problems, because instead of holding a piece of terrain, the Ukrainians are withdrawing without giving the Russians the resistance that normally happens. So the Russians are able to come in with a little bit more momentum and keep pushing. This is the end game. Look, I was told by Russian general when I was there in May. He said that, or I was there in January. He said that the map of this war will dramatically change in May.
I remember you saying that. Let me ask you this, Scott. All of the options, you're there, and somebody gives you 100,000 well-trained, heavily armed, fresh troops, right? Based on the battlefield right now, I mean, you could choose to punch through a weak spot. You could take an important spot. You got those 100,000 well-trained, fresh troops ready to act. Where do you think you'd use them?
Kharkov. That's the most pressing problem with the greatest immediate payback and the least risk. Kharkov is ready to fall. Sumi's ready to fall. When that falls, understand this: that if you come in and you take Kharkov, you're now positioned like this giant spear ready to thrust down behind the Donetsk positions. So the Ukrainians will have to withdraw no matter what. I wouldn't waste these troops trying to, because right now in Donetsk, the Ukrainians they're still holding on to towns that they've been fortifying since 2014. And so each one of these battles has the potential of becoming another Bakhmut, another Adviivka. Now Russia will win, but it takes time, it takes casualties. But if you come through Kharkov where there are no such defenses, and you come up and now you're threatening to come down, they're going to have to withdraw.
Because they get encircled, right? Because you don't have to, because you can just cut them off now. And they can't fight. You can't supply. They can't get supplies. They can't get anything. So you don't have to confront them.
Right. And so I'd rather get the Ukrainians to retreat on their own volition than dig them out of the hole. So Kharkov's it. Plus, politically speaking, Belgorod and Kursk and other the villages and towns along the Russian-Ukrainian border have been shelled and attacked by the Ukrainians, and this is a political problem for Vladimir Putin. Not that he's going to let politics drive this, but he has promised the Russian people that they will be secured. And so he needs to deliver on that. And so the best way to deliver is to kill two birds with one stone, create that demilitarized zone, and then get the Ukrainians to be compelled to pull back further. So that's what I think will probably happen. But again, I'm not a Russian general, so who knows? What will happen is part of a plan that's been well thought out by the Russians. They know exactly what they want to accomplish and how they want to accomplish it. The other interesting thing that happened is, the 60.1 billion was passed for Ukraine. Only 13.8 billion of that is military weapons. That's still a lot of weapons. I just want to remind everybody, it's a lot of weapons. A lot of those weapons were 155 millimeter artillery shells, which Ukraine desperately needs, so desperately needed that the United States had went ahead and forward positioned a lot of artillery shells in Romania. And now they put them all on a couple of ships. And those ships went into Odessa and they offloaded all the artillery shells into this warehouse complex where the next day trucks were to come in and redistribute these artillery shells all along the front line so the Ukrainians could start sending rounds down range. And yet, as soon as they got them all in there, 2 Iskander missiles came in and hit them and the whole thing blew up. Russia just took out a good large percentage of the 155 millimeter artillery shells that Ukraine was going to get under this deal. That place is still burning and blowing up right now.
They probably followed them the whole way. They probably knew where they were. They put them on a ship. We'll wait till you get them there. We'll wait till you get them all together, nice and tidy in one spot. They followed them.
Well, they're going to do that. They're going to do that for everything, because the way the resupply system works is if you look at the border of Ukraine, and Odessa is the maritime border of Ukraine. You also have places, if you notice, the Russians have been hitting a lot of places up along the Polish border. In those areas, the equipment will come in and it will get concentrated into these warehouses near on the border region. So it'll get concentrated, and then what's going to happen is they're going to be broken up into packets that will be sent out to secondary warehouses. They get broken up and tertiary, and then on and on and on until finally a truck shows up at a unit on the front. There's a map of Kharkov. So that's I'm thinking they're going to come down from the Belgorod area and take it. But Odessa is the the maritime border. If you go up by Lvov, there's borders there coming out of Poland, coming out of Romania again. There's Ivano-Frankivsk. It's an airfield area with warehouses. All these places have facilities where this equipment comes in and is going to be concentrated. The Russians haven't been hitting this because that's a transition period. It's sort of like the equivalent of a customs zone, So the stuff's going into Ukraine, the paperwork's being signed, and the Russians have been a little unwilling to inflict heavy casualties on non-Ukrainian elements out of concern that you would end up provoking a response. But now Russia has basically said that we will take these things out. So they've been hitting. So everybody's going, oh, the F-16s, the F-16s. Well, NATO had to change their whole F-16 employment plan because the idea of they tried to front load logistics into an airfield near Lvov, and all those logistics were destroyed. And so what's going to happen now is that the F-16s are going to be maintained in Polish and Romanian airfields. And then once they're maintained, you'll deploy weapons forward, but those weapons have been blown up as well. They will fly from a Romanian or a Polish airfield to a Ukrainian airfield where they will be outfitted with weaponry and therefore become military. Instead of being an equipment en route, they'll become military. Then they'll take off, they'll fly their mission, they'll recover at Ukrainian airfield, demilitarize, and then fly back to Romania and Poland where they'll be maintained. Now, I don't know if the Russians are going to allow this to happen. I think the Russians have said, if you do that, we strike these airfields anyways. But the reason why the West had to do this is that they've been trying to get all that support equipment forward to these airfields, and they're getting blown up. The Russians have broken the code. The Russians now have a good map of what's happening. They better after 2 years. And so as the stuff comes in, there's only so many places you can hide it. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't take, people always told me, Scott, in Iraq, it's such a big place. How could you possibly say that you've got everything? And I said, well, let's just start by understanding that some of the equipment that you're talking about can only be moved around on trucks, big 18-wheeler type trucks. And those trucks can only operate on certain kinds of highways. So why don't we go through the following exercise? Take out a yellow marker, take out a map of Iraq, and we'll outline all the highways that the trucks can drive on. And everything that's not in that highway area, I don't care about anymore. And so now on the highways, I have to look for facilities where they can come in. And suddenly you narrow it down there. And once you break things down based upon the reality of the situation, there's a finite number of places where these things can be. The Russians, I'm sure, have done the map study over and over again, backed up by their intelligence, and they have identified all the potential places. Now they have their agents in place. They have their intelligence collection. They have their deep reconnaissance groups doing SIGINT and taking their handheld photographs. They got it figured out. So as the stuff moves in, I believe they have eyes on target.
Oh, yeah.
And they're calling in the strikes, and ain't nothing going to get to the Ukrainians. Some ATACMS have gotten in there because they snuck in. But, even then, the ATACMS isn't going to have a meaningful impact on this battlefield at all. Russia's on the offensive, and Russia's going to stay on the offensive, and Russia's not going to allow any of this military equipment to get in their way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the place by now is like riddled with Ukraine's probably got like more Russian spies running around than they do Ukrainian citizens. When stuff hits it, they know where it is. They're hitting it. Understand they hit a big train the other day. Have you heard anything about them hitting a big headquarters or something in Odessa that took out a lot of people? Again, potentially some NATO people. Have you heard that?
I mean, I hear this all the time. I personally believe that, I just have to put on the hat that I would have worn had I been still in the military. And why would here's the question I ask for everybody who say, oh, they blew up another NATO headquarters in Ukraine. Why would I put anything significant in Ukraine that doesn't need to be there? What is the purpose of a NATO person? They provide advice. Now, I might need some small technical teams in there, turn the bolts and screws, but I'm going to infiltrate in there. This is where I get my JSOC guys or my CIA paramilitaries. They know about safe houses, and they're going to go in and they're going to create a network of safe houses, which are designed to operate under the radar.
Right.
They're not going to stay in hotels. All right. Your American teams that are out there doing it ain't staying in a hotel. They're not staying anywhere near a hotel. They're being driven in an old rusty, sedan with Ukrainian license plates, and they're dressed like Ukrainians, and they're being driven to a farmhouse where they're operating out of a barn. So that all the Russians see is that damn old rusty sedan, that's been driving that same way for years. And there's a farmer, Ivan, and is getting out doing his thing. Okay, that's how American troops are there. They're not going in there saying we're going to stay in a hotel. Why would you do that? I'm force protection. I'm saying you're not staying in a hotel. The only hotel you get to stay in is maybe in Kiev, but even then I want you staying on the embassy compound. That's why we build this big embassy compound. It's can't be attacked, so you're going to stay there and you'll sortie out of there. We don't want you spending the night in the field. You'll go out, do your thing, come back to the embassy. So this idea that there's all these NATO people over there, there's NATO planning cells in Romania, there's NATO planning cells in Poland, in Germany, modern connectivity. You got satellite communications. You don't need to be in Ukraine. You can the guy can pick up his little iPad device and you can stare at him. The same as if I'm standing in front of you talking to you, but now I'm standing here talking, but now I'm in a safe place and I have access to all my information. There are no NATO planning centers in Ukraine. It just doesn't happen that way. There might be small teams of technical experts or fact-finding missions, but there are no NATO headquarters, no NATO generals with their staffs in Ukraine, because it makes no sense. You don't need to do that. So when they are hitting these, what you're talking about is probably mercenaries. And now this is where, these mercenaries become part of the territorial army, and they go where the territorial army puts them, and they keep putting them in damn hotels. And then invariably, the boy who changes the flowers every day, he's actually a Russian agent. And he gets on his phone and he gets on Telegram channel, and he sends a message that says, that the cow jumped over the moon. But when he sends that, it's linked to where he is. So even though the message is innocuous, it's linked to the geolocation of where he's sending the message from, and the Russians go, "Thank you." The cow jumped over the moon.
Targeted in.
Boom, and it's done. That's what's happening now. An interesting thing though, Macron just we're talking about the collapse of the Ukrainian army. Macron just came out and said, if the Ukrainian army were to collapse, which they are, and the Ukrainians asked us to intervene, which they will, then we will send troops to the front lines, and then they'll die. But I mean, so Macron is once again, and I really like to hear his generals speak up.
Let me throw something at you, Scott. One of the things that Macron has said for some period of time, he's been an advocate of we need to have a European army. It's not that they don't want to be colonialist and imperialist and run around the world. They do. But in fact, it seems to me that they're starting to see the U.S. empire crumble. And Macron still wants to be, Napoleon Macron, right? We're starting to, even Radikov Sikorsky or whatever his name is saying, the U.S. We need our own, what do you call them, some kind of brigades or storm brigades or whatever the hell kind of brigades, right? What you're starting to hear in Europe is this chorus of Europe needs its own military. Europe needs its own army. Europe needs its own this and that, right? Like the U.S., number one, I think they're having some issues with the U.S. They're not happy with being dominated as much as they are. Number two, I think they want to be, if the U.S. collapses, we want to have our own empire here that can go around the world and do stuff. Is it possible that some of this stuff from Macron is a push, is a ruse, we need our own empire, and that there's work going on to try to get Europe to even break away a little bit from the U.S., from some of the ruling elite, to get their own military and their own army, so they can see that the U.S. is crumbling and maybe they want their own stuff? What do you think about that? Is that far-fetched?
No, and we'll just go a step further. I'm not an economist, and I don't play one on TV, and I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So, but I know enough about French post-colonial economics to understand the decisive role that Africa plays in the French economy, from the uranium mines in Niger to the control of there's two versions of the Africa franc that are at play there that gives France total control over the financial institutions of a large swath of Africa. The favoritism that France gets in terms of trade relations, etc. Many people, and some people believe even Macron, made their fortunes off of the exploitation of Africa, and that is collapsing as we speak. In the former French Sahel, you have Mali, you have Burkina Faso, you have Niger, all having evicted. Chad is talking about potentially Senegal kicking them out. And this is a huge economic crisis for not just France, but for the political elites, who were basically, having checks sent to them every month because of the exploitation of Africa. And so Macron is overseeing the collapse of French post-colonialism in Africa. This is a huge blow to French prestige and French, economic and geopolitical relevance. So at the same time, he's looking at Europe, and he's seeing, he gave a very interesting speech the other day where he said that, Europe could disappear, just basically, could go extinct. I mean, there's a chance that Europe is, I've been saying this forever, because Europe is going to go extinct. The European Union is an unsustainable notion. NATO is collapsing as we speak. Scott, how can it collapse? It just expanded. It took in Sweden and Finland. Hey, study the Roman Empire and take a look at the map. There was a period of time right before the collapse where they actually sent legions out and expanded a little bit. And everybody go, oh, whoosh, boom, done. Attila the Hun came in, Battle of Chalons, and that's it. All she wrote. That's where Europe is. This war in Ukraine is going to accelerate many of these processes. Russia will win decisively. And Russia will not invade Europe, which leaves Europe. One of the big problems that Europe's going to face in a post-conflict world is all of this political rhetoric that's gone into the need to build a NATO army, a European army, which is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars that they don't have because their economies are shrinking, their economies are collapsing. But now they're going to have to invest in the military. And when Russia stops and doesn't do what everybody said they're going to do, now they're going to go, well, wait a minute, do we really need to spend this money because Russia's not doing that? Maybe we need to. And then America's going to get upset, Poland's going to get upset, Europe's going to fall in a little intramural diplomatic firefight.
New parties will win. Presidents and pro-U.S. people will be replaced like hell. They're going to be out of there.
And so it's just the Russians, again, Russia didn't start this conflict with this in mind. And I don't think because Russia, again, I've learned I've always respected him, but the more I get to know the guy, the more I value his insights. Anatoly Antonov is the Russian ambassador to the United States. And he, from the very first meeting, he told me one of the most important words for him, concepts for him, is predictability. He said, I will take a bad situation that's predictable over a good situation that's unpredictable. Right. Because my job as a strategic thinker is to project out, to talk about the future, to make plans, to allocate resources. And if you have predictability, you can do that. You can manage a bad situation effectively. But if you have a good situation, but it's unpredictable, you don't know, is it going to stay good? How do you plan for that? Okay, it's good. We're going to plan for good. No, it's bad. Oh, damn, but we didn't plan for bad. So now and suddenly you're all over the map. So the Russians want predictability. So the Russians aren't about creating chaos. The chaos is the absolute opposite of what Russia wants. That's why Russia doesn't do soft power coups and things like that, create chaos. Russia wants predictability. Russia would rather have a Ukraine that joins the European Union, and isn't plugged into the Russian economy, but was predictable, than a Ukraine that was just all over the map and not knowing what's going on. Russia wants predictability. So Russia's not going to talk about moving on to Europe and all that stuff. So Russia never planned that. But the Russians, never look a gift horse in the mouth, man. So you're like, okay, well, we're trying to be responsible here, contain this thing, have predictable outcomes and all that. And Europe's just going haywire. And the Russians are like, okay, we're just going to sit back and enjoy the show. Now, but they don't enjoy it. Why? It's unpredictable.
It's dangerous.
It's very dangerous. So the Russians want predictability. The Russians would prefer that Europe gets its act together. Russia would prefer that the again, an interesting concept. Conventionally thinking, if I asked a Russian politician or a Russian diplomat, who they thought would be better for Russia, Joe Biden or Donald Trump, I think most Americans would say Donald Trump. Hey, first of all, we've been told he's a Russian asset. He's he's bought and paid for and all that stuff. I can't speak for any Russian diplomats or things, but my money's on Joe Biden.
Mine too. He took out NATO for him. Not for them. He took out NATO. You know what I mean? But like you said, he's predictable.
But he's also predictable.
He's predictable.
Joe Biden is predictable. You know what Joe Biden's going to do, so you can plan for it. You can prepare for it. Donald Trump is the least predictable American president. He's all over the frickin' map. I want to be your friend, but I'm going to sanction you to death. So the Russians are all about predictable outcomes. And yet what's happening in Europe, what's getting ready to happen in Europe is the most unpredictable. And now we come back to Macron. Macron is trying to infuse predictability. He's trying to create structure. And since America's not doing it right now because we're in the political silly season and we don't have the resources and we're overstretched in Taiwan and Israel and all this, Macron is trying to come in and infuse some French flavored structure onto this situation. But the problem is, this is a situation that requires titanium, scaffolding, hard, strong. And all Macron got is bamboo. And it's old rotten bamboo. It's bamboo that's been sitting in the backyard, uncovered, rain's coming down on it. You pick it up and half of it's collapsing. And he's promising structure, but he doesn't have what it takes. The predictability that he's trying to infuse is actually unpredictable because it's unsustainable. And this has got to drive the Russians crazy. I'm just thinking this. I don't know this, but I'm just saying, knowing that the Russians like predictability, this situation right now that's facing, because in America, the conventional wisdom is the Russians are happy. That's what they're saying. This is playing right into the Russians' hands, all this chaos and all that stuff. I tend to believe the Russians aren't happy because Russia doesn't want the collapse of the West.
Right. Who wants a failed state on their border? Russia, that's the one thing they don't want. They don't want a failed state on their border. They don't want people coming across the border. And not only that, if Europe becomes stable, somebody in Europe may say, let's start buying gas again. Somebody in Europe may say, perhaps we need a security agreement with Russia. A stable Europe, stable people may suddenly say, let's start to work things out. And you know what I mean? So they don't want a chaotic Europe.
Did you hear what the new gas is?
No.
Because how Russian gas was the thing that, the United States said, you're addicted to Russian gas. We don't want you to be addicted to Russian gas. And Europe was like, well, we really like Russian gas because we make everything cheap and we have more money in our pockets and we can retire early. Fertilizer. The entire European agricultural sector is addicted to cheap Russian fertilizer. And now the United States has come out and said, well, you have to get off this addiction. You can't be addicted. You can't be, And so now how stupid can the Europeans be? I mean, they had this wonderful gas heroin coming into their system. They're like, oh, God, this is great. I get to live nice and retire. And I can talk about working a 4-day work week. And I can go on vacations for 3 months. And this is great because we don't have to pay all this surcharge for gas. Now they're like bankrupt, no vacations, nothing, but they get to eat. They get to eat and grow things because thank God you got Russian fertilizer that comes in because it's cheap in Russia. They make a lot of it. It's cheaper than the European stuff. And now the United States is going, no, can't do that either. So now your price of food's going to go out. Your crops are going to collapse. When is Europe going to learn that the best friend in the world they have is a rich and prosperous Russia? Because a rich and prosperous Russia will bring some of that prosperity over, low energy, low fertilizers, peace and prosperity. You don't have to spend $100 billion building militaries you don't need. And Russia has no intention of occupying Europe, of moving on Europe. Russia just wants to live in peace. Imagine that. But nobody in the West is allowed to think that, because that's Russian propaganda.